welcome to my channel. My name is Lauren. In the month of April, I read books that were set within the American South. In total, I read 6 books. The genres of these books ranged a lot, and the majority of the books actually blended multiple ones. So within these books, you see magical realism show up, as well as historical fiction, obviously horror. There's a little bit of fantasy, some like romance vibes, as well as one nonfiction book that I think would most appropriately fit within either the history section or actually probably cultural studies. And let's get to them. The first book I read this month was The Spite House by Johnny Compton. This was actually a buddy read I did with Christine at Secrets Read. We did sprints together. It was my first time hosting sprints on my channel, and we had a blast along with Michelle from Michelle's Melancholia, who I was also buddy reading another book with her. So it's really cool to have all my buddy reads on one sprint, and I was just kind of bopping between the 2 books. Ultimately, I gave Spite House 3.5 stars. I feel like it was really great with its pacing. It was super easy to read and dive back in and out of. It has one of my favorite tropes, which was the haunted house. It dealt with a bit of racial commentary as well, which I always appreciate in books. I love the supernatural elements of this story, that they were really interesting. I feel like with my critiques, I echo the larger perspective when people have talked about how they feel about this book, in that I feel like there was a lot that wasn't answered or like fleshed out, and that there were a lot of things that were going on, different storylines that didn't get wrapped up in a way that felt satisfying for me as the reader. But overall, I had a really fun time reading this book. I feel like it was very unique in a lot of ways, and although it didn't really execute what it went out to do, I feel like I enjoyed my reading process, and it did not feel like a waste of time. Like, I was always curious, I was always interested. I feel like I was very invested in the characters. I thought they were really easy to be interested in, and they had like a lot of stuff going on. Like, they are a family with problems. Spite showed up here in very interesting ways, obviously in the title, but also there are multiple characters in this story who are very much driven by their spite. And I feel like, to me, their spite emerges from this like cocktail of emotions that include like anger, frustration, and also I think a lot of like hurt and pain. I do feel like I was let down a bit when it came to the actual reveal of what was going on in the haunted house. I thought that the situation with the family was going on there with the little sister was a little bit more compelling to me, and I wanted more answers for that. We really don't get it. Not necessarily the most memorable book that I'll look back on and think, oh, that book was amazing, but I think it is enjoyable if you do love the haunted house trope, you like a little bit of supernatural stuff in there, and possibly even like a dash of cosmic horror. The next book I read with a southern setting was Rootwork by Tracy Cross, which is actually the first book in the Conjure series. I cannot tell you how much I freaking love this book. It is everything I was looking for when it came to a book set in the American South. It is a blend of historical fiction, horror, magical realism, and I think even like some fantasy elements in this too. So if you're like a fantasy person, this might actually be great for you. I'm not a fantasy person, and I gobbled this up completely. Rootwork follows 3 sisters who live in the American South at the height of Jim Crow racial segregation. You have the Civil War ending 20 years earlier. For the most part, life for Black people has not really changed. And you see that there are some like really monstrous people that enact a lot of racial violence and sexual violence toward the Black community, and they're truly the monsters. You have these 3 sisters dealing with not just like racial violence enacted by the white community, also white leaders like a police officer, but also like sexual violence too is a big part of this story and the situations that arise for these characters. But you also have some really beautiful moments and themes regarding like family, friendship, and communities, like a huge theme in this as well. Like, you'd think with like 3 sisters, it'd be kind of hard to like tell them apart, but they are so well developed as characters. Everybody in the story is just like so distinctive, and you just really feel like it's so real. The atmosphere and the vibe of this book is spot on, chef's kiss, exactly what I wanted. Oh, like seriously, truly, I think this has to be one of my favorite books, and there was nothing that made me happier than realizing that there should be like 2 more books in this series, and the second one comes out, I am buying that. The third book I read this month was the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix, which I actually listened to on audio. This book is like one of the last and final Grady Hendrix horror books that I have not yet read. Funnily enough, this is like the third Grady Hendrix book I've read this year, and I didn't really even plan that. It just so perfectly wraps into the themes I've been doing for each of these months. And also there was like a new release as well I was highly anticipating but didn't really enjoy. But the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, I think I enjoyed. I don't know, I'm like still kind of processing and like figuring that out for myself. It's about a group of like white Southern women who have a book club. It's all about like true crime. And then they have this newcomer come into their community. He's this like very mysterious white man, and he ends up like really ingratiating himself into their families' lives, the children, the husband, their like economic situations and businesses. And then there's the question thrown in there about like, is he a vampire? Is he actually like lying to them and deceiving them and ultimately gonna like screw them over? This book is complicated to me because I felt like I always wanted to listen to it. I was intrigued. I found the characters to be compelling, and I did like how things ended. That felt nice and satisfying. And I don't even mind so much that there wasn't a lot of horror. I feel like with Grady Hendrix, it's not necessarily a huge vocal point. Even though he's like a horror writer, it's like kind of in the background. You don't really read his books to be grossed out. That can happen sometimes, but it's like kind of like an add-on in some ways. I always enjoy it, but this one I feel like I took issue with like, I don't know, I feel like I felt so conflicted about the centering of like the white perspective, but more specifically the white female perspective. I found it interesting to kind of see how like whiteness is guiding a lot of the decisions of the white characters. And I think it was appropriate for a white man to write the white perspective. Like that makes sense. But I guess I'm just fatigued by the constant centering of white people and white needs and white concerns. And there having to be some type of downside for Black people. Like you see the trope in this book about a Black person's death causing some type of like myth or mystery that I feel like has shown up in a lot of other works. So I guess I'm conflicted because I'm tired of reading books by white people that talk about the pain of Black people and how it's so inconveniencing for white people to inconvenience themselves in pursuit of doing what is morally right to help like provide more opportunities or just like basic safety for Black people. But on the other hand, I felt like it was important to showcase that like inner working that like is required for white people, and in this case white women, to be okay with inconveniencing themselves, and that there is a process for like distancing yourself from whiteness, which is ultimately happening in this book in order to take down this villain. So again, if you're somebody who finds it hard to stomach white people dancing around their own kind of like inconveniences in the face of like Black people not just being harmed but like killed, this probably will not be the book for you. And I think I'm still processing it, so I fear that I'm not like kind of communicating it well. But if you've read the book, you kind of understand. Black characters take a back seat in this story. They're just being harmed. They're just kind of waiting for the white people, the white women, to step up and use their power in ways that will be in community with others and in service of other people. And it's like they ultimately wait until it starts to really negatively impact their community, until it's like super visible for them to do anything. And in some cases, it's like, oh, gotta watch that, gotta read that. But ultimately shining a light on that is also a horror that Grady Hendrix is trying to highlight through his work. So I'm of two minds here. I thought it was really compelling and engaging, but also dipped into a lot of kind of stereotypes or just tropes that I find to be tiring at this point. And I don't know, maybe somebody else can explain it in a way that gets better at articulating my thoughts. If you also like relate and see it this way, I'd love to hear those down in the comments. The other book I read on audiobook was Ring Shout by P. Djeli Clark, which is a blend of horror, fantasy, and historical fiction. I kind of picked this one up as like a mood read this month. I didn't anticipate reading it when April started, but I was really happy I did give it a shot. It is a fantastic story that is right up my alley. I love historical fiction when it's blended with horror, and this book is kind of set in an alternate universe of sorts, because you have three women who served in World War I coming back to their hometown in the South, and they are just so badass. In reality, women were not serving active combat roles in World War I, but these women were, and I think it makes for a very intriguing setup for the story. You also have some like magical elements as well, and then you have basically these creatures that take the shape or form and kind of maybe possess Ku Klux Klan leaders in their community. So you can see here that there's some messaging regarding the monstrosity of racism, and what is really being centered again in this book is resilience of the Black community and their leaning on their ancestors, their past, being unable to escape it, having to make terms with it, and ultimately using the past, their ancestors, as tools for overcoming the issues in the present that stem from history. My only caution about this book is that there are tons of historical references and allusions. Like one time they mentioned Marcus Garvey, and I think that might be intimidating to somebody who is not really well versed in US history. I'm a history teacher, so that wasn't something that I found to be hard to get through. If anything, it made this book even more enjoyable. But I just kind of like keep that in mind, and maybe even keep tabs of those kind of historical references on like your notes app or something, and then this could be a really great opportunity for you to go and research those things and learn about them. I don't feel like this is actually a horror novel. I think it's like mismarketed, but if you're looking for a more like fantasy, magical realism story that's very plot driven and a little bit funny, I think you'd really like this. And it's not a series at all, but I think it is a really cool way of looking at very like kind of H.P. Lovecrafty vibes, but like not racist, you know? Another book I read this month and freaking loved was Mina and the Undead, which is written by Amy McCaw and set within New Orleans in the 90s. I already have the sequel on its way, so I'm really looking forward to reading that this summer, very soon. Like, the vibes are just like up here, 10 out of 10. Love it. Like, I really felt like I was back in the French Quarter. And my only concern with this book is that some of like the myths they use, which is a huge part of the plot of this book, are not necessarily like historically accurate in terms of the terminology. So for example, there was a reference to Madame Lalaurie, who is very notorious for being awful towards enslaved people, and there being a lot of like New Orleans mythology around that and what she did. And just the use of like who she harmed as labeling them as victims, to me kind of erased the reality of like racism and made enslaved people invisible, when that was like a huge part of the American culture at the time. And to not mention that they were enslaved as well as victims, I think is a disservice to the reality. So that was just my one concern. Ultimately, this book is fantastic for any kind of reader, whether you are a horror lover, you are fantasy. You also have a bit of romance in here as well. I love when authors also include like little cliffhangers at the end of a chapter that gets you like wanting to start the next one. And that would happen every so often in this book. Not too much where I was like, okay, this is like very Goosebumps R.L. Stine, but enough where I was like, okay, turn in those pages. Like, it's such a good time. It is basically a vampire mystery that always keeps you guessing, and I didn't guess and figure out what was going on at the end of that big reveal, but I enjoyed every second of it. So I highly recommend this book. So the last book I read for this month is actually nonfiction. It's Tales from the Haunted South: Dark Tourism and Memories of Slavery from the Civil War Era by Taya Miles. I've been trying to get back into my nonfiction reading game. I have a whole lot of history books I gotta get to, and one I thought was really appropriate for my travels at the start of April is this book right here by Taya Miles. It is a blend of history and cultural studies, and what it does is it tries to really showcase the different narratives that are told in certain southern cities and towns, and kind of poke some holes in them and consider why we have the stories that we do, specifically, largely, mostly about enslaved people and oftentimes enslaved women. So the book itself isn't meant to just tell folklore or myths. It's really short for a history book. It's only about 130 pages. It includes a lot of like first-person narratives, which is awesome because you really kind of need that in this book, where it's all about how you tell the story of the past and what we get wrong, what we get right. And so she goes to a lot of these places and experiences these tours in New Orleans, in Savannah, and she just like observes and considers what it says about how so many companies make so much profit off the exploitation of Black ghost stories, paralleling how white people have exploited the labor of black people during the time in American history where slavery was legal. So it's a really interesting parallel that was like super new to me, and it put in my like interest into like spooky tourism or like dark tourism, put it in a whole new light and made me think a little bit more ethically about it. Like, is it okay that mostly white people who run these ghost tours or any kind of space that markets ghost stories about black people, is it okay that they make profit off of that when the enslaved people themselves were exploited for the profit of white people? So it gave me a lot to chew on, needless to say, and it helped me really put in perspective a lot of things. And even just reading this for the Madame Lalaurie chapter alone was worth it, and I did read that before I went to New Orleans, so I had a lot of perspective for when I got that story told to me on one of the ghost tours I went on. But I'd love to know if you had any suggestions for horror books specifically that are set in the South, or maybe that they're similar to any of the books I really, really loved. I'd love your recommendations down below in the comments. If you made it this far, be sure to leave a little vampire emoji down in the comments in honor of my Merlot's Bar t-shirt, one of the premier bars in the South. If you're looking for more book recommendations, definitely check out my video where I match books to episodes of Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities. I'll see you all in that video. Bye!